Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Kevin Baker, the author of The New York Game, Baseball, and the Rise of a New City. He's written at least 10 books, and his writing has appeared in too many publications to count. Kevin, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. Somehow, the year 2000 is 24 years ago. And that year, the Yankees were doing their usual, at least for that time period. And the Mets, my Mets, were finally good too. And with each passing playoff series, I could see that the two teams were on a collision course. I was thrilled I could finally see the Mets in the World Series. But why did it have to be against them? But I can't lie, it did feel special to have the eyes of the sports world fully on New York City. The Subway Series didn't turn out the way I wanted, but it did remind people that before the rise of the NBA, New York was a baseball town. Kevin, your book describes how baseball made New York and how New York made baseball. Before we get to all that, what makes baseball the ideal sport to write and read about?
Well, thanks so much, Evan. Yeah, hard to say what makes it the ideal sport. I think in some ways the fact that it proceeds in sort of limited segments. It's like one batter after another batter, that at bat, one inning after another inning. Uh, every play is sort of can be scrutinized and shown. I think something about the summer, playing it between the April and October is something that brings back feelings of nostalgia. I know for me, the best times I had with my father was when we went to the ballpark in up in New
Me
York,
too.
up in Boston,
Me too.
So yeah, those were, I think that brings a natural kind of feeling to it. It's a great radio game. It's a
Yeah.
amazing game to hear on the radio. You can picture it much more than almost any other sport. So it's a lot of that is the reason I think why it lends itself so easily to writing.
There are other cities with amazing baseball histories, without a doubt. Cincinnati, St. Louis,
Mhm. Yeah.
Baltimore, Boston, Chicago. What made you realize that the crossroads was the Big Apple?
Mhm. Well, New York really was where what we know as baseball today evolved. Really, people have been playing bat and ball games since we got off the Savannah and or got onto the Savannah. And going back to ancient Egypt, there are records of it. In early America, there were all kinds of different regional games, the Massachusetts game, the Philadelphia game, etc. But the game of baseball really did evolve in New York. These were the New York rules or the Knickerbocker rules, the team which first wrote them down. Um, and yeah, New York has always been a big baseball town. I would say it still is, much as New Yorkers love their football, much as they love basketball. I would say that New York is still much more a baseball town than almost any other city in the US. Maybe St. Louis with the devotion to the Cardinals,
Yeah.
maybe Boston with the Red Sox, but even there, even in Boston, teams such as the Patriots and the Celtics have maybe, passed the Red Sox in terms of the town's
Yeah.
affection. Here, Yankees and Mets between them, and it still has a powerful hold.
There is a feeling that I think I had, and probably still have to some extent,
Mhm.
that baseball sort of came from the woods. That you go up to Cooperstown, and you're sort of in like the heart of where baseball was invented. Although, of course, that's been debunked 10,000 times. But there's this feeling that like you have to sort of be away from it all to feel the roots of the game. But you argue that that feeling is just wrong, that baseball needed cities to thrive and to develop as a game. How did you start to put this thesis together that cities are what fueled baseball.
Yeah, it's interesting as you say. Baseball has been determined to stick to this kind of pastoral myth. It started with little
The
boys playing
cows,
it in a
yeah,
cow pasture.
yeah.
The Hall of Fame is in Cooperstown because supposedly one day in 1839, Abner Doubleday invented it along the banks of the local lake, the Glimmerglass. Uh, it's completely untrue, so outrageously untrue that one man who isn't in the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown is Abner Doubleday.
Mm.
Not even they can quite swallow that myth. But still they kind of admitted it right from the beginning. Well, if you had to pick a charming town that represented all that's best about America, it's Cooperstown. And certainly it is a charming town. I've got up to Cooperstown a couple times,
It's
love
the
it.
greatest place ever. It's an
Yeah,
incredible
yeah.
place.
Yeah, no, it was amazing place, kind of brilliant. They really pushed this in the 30s during the Great Depression, and they needed to make it into more of a tourist town. Some farmer even found in his barn the supposed first ball that that Doubleday used. Wonderful crockery, wonderful fraud. But really, American agricultural agrarian life very hard to get together 18 people at any
Right,
given time.
right.
American farms are big, they're spread out. Really it lent itself to the urban game. You had all these lots all over, particularly in New York, in Manhattan and Brooklyn, where you could get together 18 people pretty easily. And early on, people of all walks of life, as David Block and John Thorne have demonstrated, started forming these clubs. And it was gentlemen's, clubs, and they were, clerks doing this stuff. But, also day laborers, working men, pretty much every profession pretty soon had their own baseball teams. Milkmen, cops, firefighters, eye doctors all had their own teams in the New York area and started playing ball against each other.
And
And yeah,
you could use a fire hydrant for first base, the edge of that car
yeah.
for second base,
Oh,
the stoop over there for third base, and then home plate would be the manhole in the middle of the street.
definitely. And that's stickball, which evolved in the city too and became one of the city's great pastimes. It was played with local kids in the street by the likes of Willie Mays and also even Mickey Mantle. They would go out and hit the Spalding around with a broom handle. It really was this urban game.
And one crazy thing about baseball is how far the game goes
Yes.
back. I mean, we're talking about like
Oh yeah.
pre-Civil War.
Oh yeah.
And the Civil War is a major force for how the game winds up spreading. All these people came together from all over. They shared the game, and then they went back to their cities with the game. What are the earliest traces of baseball on the land that is now considered New York City?
Yeah, very true, Evan. The Civil War really was the what led to the New York game kind of conquering all. Um, we have traces of baseball games going back to at least 1823. Games between different clubs that were advertised outside a tavern in around 8th Street in Manhattan. Although there were games being played at Columbia, which was then downtown. Columbia University or before that. It really goes back into the mists of time. Uh, but it really starts taking off 1820s, 1830s, and 40s. As you say, the Civil War was a great way of spreading it all over the country. It surpasses all these other games. Um, it was hard as we might find to believe it today, it was considered very fast. The people like Mark Twain and Walt Whitman felt it exemplified the national character in being a game that was just sped along, kind of this rocketing pace. Yeah, and it was up to as late as 1919. There was a major league game played at 58 minutes between the Giants
Mm.
and the Phillies. So it did move fast. One of the other, it was very statistical. Americans have always loved statistics, and it's always appealed to us a great deal. And it was a big betting game, and that's sort
Yeah.
of the devil in the works. But
That was my next
yeah,
question. Your book spends a lot of time explaining how these groups formed clubs and how clubs formed teams and how those teams began realizing that they could charge money for
yeah.
different things. How did money play a role in the growth of this sport in New York?
Oh, it played a huge role very early on. And John Thorne is very funny talking about how it was kind of the corrupt elements that really brought the sport forward. Yeah, very early on, the first World Championship, which of course was played between Manhattan and Brooklyn in I think 1858, but they were already charging something like 50 cents to spectators, which was a lot of money back then. The very first New York acknowledged professional team, and there was a lot of under the table professionalism, but in the National Association, the first league, the first New York team, the New York Mutual, run by Boss Tweed and his friends, uh, players were suspended for throwing games, for hippodroming, as it was called, and the team was suspended. So, right from the beginning, there was this element of corruption that had kind of crept in there, and it was often sort of funny. It was often sort of just disregarded, but it really became something that came to almost destroy the sport. And I think we're back at a point now where we should be looking at that
Oh, no
past.
kidding. I
Mm,
mean,
mm.
the fact that gambling is now a featured part of the game.
Yeah.
And, okay,
Mm,
there may not be a huge incentive for,
mm, mm,
I don't know,
mm,
I'm making up names here, but
mm, mm,
Francisco Lindor making $34 million a year,
mm,
he may not have a huge
mm.
incentive to mess around. But what about a player making, the league minimum or something close to that and realizing he's only got a couple years left in baseball and someone approaches him? Um, how do we deal with that?
Yeah, very, very true. And I think baseball is counting on that. There's so much money now that the players won't be corrupted. First of all, gambling, particularly in its later stages, is a compulsion. It's not a rational thing to do.
Mhm.
Uh, it's a compulsion, and it can take people beyond what would be in their best. It certainly wasn't in the best interest for Pete Rose to endanger everything by gambling, but he did. And it kind of the danger warning should have been when you had this scandal that was sort of quickly hushed up, where Shohei Ohtani's translator was indicted for gambling on games. I don't know. The premise there is that supposedly Ohtani let his translator control $16 million in his bank account. I find that hard to believe, and I worry that this is only the start of something else. Don't get me wrong, Otani's a great, great player, but it's interesting to go back 1919, the World Series is thrown, something set and fixed incidentally in New York. Um, and right after that, Babe Ruth comes to the city in 1920.
Mm.
And that saves the game as much as anything. Baseball really clamps down on gambling, but also Ruth comes here. And now baseball is trying tirelessly to make out that Ohtani is the new Ruth or better.
Mm.
He's not, but forget that for a moment. He's a great, great player. But if the
I
new
won't tell him you
savior,
said that.
yeah, but if the new savior is involved with gambling, then where are we? And
Mm.
baseball has to look at, and as you say, people who are paid less, and forget the players. What about umpires? What about clubhouse boys? What about all sorts of people who are associated with the game but don't make the big bucks? Now that they can bet on pretty much every play, uh, what's gonna happen? And I think baseball really needs to take a look at that.
I'm concerned
All
about it. I'm
sports
I'm
do.
concerned about it, especially given the amount of promotion going into it.
Yeah.
All right. What are the earliest seeds of
Mm.
some of the teams that we know today? I mean, the Yankees, the
Uh,
Giants, and the Dodgers are the major league teams, the early ones in New York that we think of. How did these teams start to develop out of the streets of the city?
Oh, they're great stories. Just one more thing about gambling though,
Oh yeah.
too. It also, even apart from throwing games, whether people throw games or not, I think it seriously distorts how we think about things. I watch all these kind of sports analysis shows, uh, and they always have a segment now where they go into the gambling. It's encouraging people to think of something not as an amazing athletic endeavor and not as a wonderful partisan pastime, but as something where you can purely make money on. And I think that's sort of like
Pe-
that's really corrupting the soul of America in so many ways.
People come up
And
to me at work
not
and they
least of
say,
that.
"How could the Mets have done this to me?" And I'm like, "I know they lost." And like, "Well, I lost my bet."
I
And
know.
I'm like, "Well, I'm sorry to hear that. I'm sorry they lost because they lost."
What happens when we raise a generation to just think of things in that way?
It may be
What
several
a,
generations. The people I
yeah,
talk to are not in their teens. I mean, these people are in their
yeah,
40s and 50s,
yeah.
you know? All right, so tell us about the
But
team
anyway,
names. It's
but yeah, the
amazing. Yeah.
team names are great stories. The Giants, the New York Baseball Giants, were the favorite team of uh, of the city for quite a while. Very much the Irish team. My father and uncle, whose mother's last name was Murphy, grew up in Fordham Road. They were Giants fans. The Giants came that thing they were originally called the Gothams. Giants came from Justin, the owner and manager, referring to them as my Giants. But they were hugely popular. The Dodgers were called all kind. Baseball nicknames were much more eccentric and passing in those days. The Dodgers were called all kinds of things. They were called the Brooklyn Grays. They were called the Bridegrooms because much of the team got married one off season. And it was rumored they were withholding having sex until the season was over, which was very risque for the
Yeah.
time. Titillated people. They were called the Superbas because their manager's last name was the same name as somebody who had this troupe called the Superbas, this acrobatic troupe. They were called the Robins, right? In headlines, often to the end of the Dodgers' stay in Brooklyn, they were sometimes called the Robins or the Flock because they had another beloved manager and general manager named Wilbert Robinson. But were called the Dodgers as for Trolley Dodgers. And this was one of the weirdest things. It's apparently Trolley Dodgers was a name that Manhattanites would call people from Brooklyn derisively. It meant sort of like bumpkins. And it's weird because there were trolleys all over Manhattan too. It's as if today people in Manhattan called Brooklynites, you subway riders.
Right. Right.
It makes zero sense, but there it was, and Dodgers came from that.
And the stories
I
of the Yankees is really cool too. We think of it as northerner, but that's just because they were further north than the rest of the city.
Yeah, they were up on originally they were up on Washington Heights. They were at 168th Street, and they were north of the Giants and north of the city. So right from their first season, they were called the Highlanders, but they were also called the Yankees, and also probably from American League was one of the reasons to get the other New York American. So that came from that. It makes no sense either. If anything, Boston should be the Boston Yankees, but
Right. Right.
instead it's the New York Yankees.
Talk about some of the first stars. I just thought your chapter on Christy Mathewson. I mean,
Oh yeah.
it's so deep the number of stars that there are. I mean, just thinking about,
Mm.
Joe DiMaggio seems like eons ago, and Mickey Mantle to me seems like eons ago, but Christy Mathewson was way before these people. And
Yeah.
what an interesting fellow. Talk about this amazing Giants pitcher in, I guess, the 19 beginning of the 1900s, 1905 or so, right?
Yeah, he came to the Giants, I think in '02 or '03, and very interesting character, as you say. Originally sort of hated by his teammates because he was this kind of goody two shoes. He would say things like, if a man would cheat on his wife, maybe he would betray his country too. But very early on, excuse me, he learned to get on with them and became absolutely beloved. And of course, it helped that he was, one of the greatest pitchers ever. But it's an interesting thing in New York characters. Uh, Great players, much valued players come here and they get on or they don't with their teammates. And people like Mathewson, like Joe DiMaggio, as you say, like Mantle to a great degree, early on learned to get on at least with their teammates and management, and then win over the fans as well. Derek Jeter, others such as Reggie Jackson or A-Rod had much more trouble with that, and it made their stays in New York all the harder. Mathewson, really interesting because he would go in and gamble and with his teammates, and he'd go in and fight with them. They'd get in these brawls, and he at one point he punched out a teenage vendor who had inserted himself into a brawl. They loved that. They would do anything for him. He just seemed very able. He was to get along with anybody. Amazing thing Frank DeFord points out in his biography of him was Mathewson, who was he and his wife were he was college educated. He was an upstanding Protestant Republican, and yet he and his wife roomed for years, shared an apartment for years on Manhattan's Upper West Side with his manager, John McGraw, and his wife, who were Democrats, Catholics, really opposite sides of each other, but they got on like gangbusters, shared this apartment. DeFord says he can't think of any other example of a manager and the superstar in his team doing this. I can't either. It was really just an extraordinary thing, his ability to get on with other people. And he's the
And
first great star in
and
the
John
in the
McGraw,
game.
I mean, he married the Giants for 30 years. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
that's like Bobby Cox level type stuff.
Oh yeah, McGraw managed the Giants for 30 years. They contended almost every single season. They had winning records almost every single year. He not only managed them, he would go out and scout players. He was sort of the de facto general
The front
manager
office,
for a
yeah,
lot of
right.
that time. He was the front office. He was an incredible one of the very few great players, and he was a great player. I think he's something like third still all time in on base percentage, one of the very few great players to also be a great manager, and made the adjustment from the so-called dead ball era, the pitching oriented game, to the home run era, and without a problem.
Talk about Jack Chesbro. I barely had heard of him, but I read this story and all I can think of is the sad, I'm a Mets fan, so it's the other side of it. But it reminded me of Bill Buckner. In this case, I think he's on the Highlanders at that point,
Yes, yeah.
and he throws a wild pitch, and it's the wild pitch heard around the city. And here I am crying 125 years later for this poor guy's
Oh, well,
fate.
great. Well, thanks. Yeah. Happy Jack Chesbro was probably the all-time example of how unfairly fans and
Right.
sports writers have treated players.
I know, and I love how you're defending.
Yeah.
You're trying to set the record straight a century and a half later after this wild pitch.
Happy Jack Chesbro, which he was called sarcastically. He was a rather glum fellow, apparently. But he comes for the Yankees. He signs out of the National League when the American League and the Yankees are started. In 1904, he wins 41 games. To this day, the record.
Yeah,
And talk
and it
about
will be the record.
unbreakable sport.
Yeah,
Yeah, unless the game changes beyond
right.
our recognition, that will be the record forever. Wins 41 games. He has these amazing, and most of the games he loses, like 12, most of the games he loses, like his teams, gets shut out or scores one run, so he's,
Bad
uh,
luck, like Jacob DeGrom with the
uh,
Mets, right?
last day of the season, big game against the Red Sox, then the Pilgrims are just going to decide everything in the American League. He throws this, he allows two unearned runs from terrible errors behind him. Uh, Hits a triple, hits a single, drives in one of the two Yankees runs. It's the ninth inning. A guy gets on again from another error. He's on third base, and Chesbro throws a wild pitch that some people think really should have been a pass ball, but in any case, throws a wild
You
pitch.
got to look at the replay. You
Yeah,
got to watch the replay.
they lose 3-2, and it's crushing. And from then on, sports writers come up to after he retires a few years later. Sports writers come up to his farm in Western Mass, and for more stories about the day you blew the pennant, it's like, and he puts up with. I would have had the family shotgun ready for
Yeah,
these
right,
guys,
right, right.
but this goes on how he blew it.
One one unbelievable thing about your book is how you're able to piece together all these stories. What are the sources for all this stuff? Where are you finding all this
Oh.
information about these games and individual players and the box scores seem to go back forever?
Oh, well, I was standing on the shoulders of giants. There's been so much great writing about the game. I mean, Roger Angel, John Thorne, the old game particularly, all these guys, just brilliant, brilliant writing, decade after decade. Lee Montville's great book about Babe Ruth, Jane Levy's writings through several eras. These are fantastic writers, and I was able to take advantage of that. Basically, I've been reading about the sport since I was 8 years old and first started following it. So this has been a lifetime sort of labor of love here.
Were you digging through old newspapers and archives?
Oh, some, but much more just, I knew a lot of these stories
Uh-huh.
already, so I was fortunate in that.
How did your path take you from writing some fiction books and writing, I guess, even fiction baseball books to these
Mhm.
nonfiction books? Did you find that being able to tell a story and I guess make up a story in fiction helped you tell a great tale about baseball in the real world?
Oh, yeah, good question. I've dabbled in both for quite a while. My first job I ever had, I was a schoolboy sports reporter for the local daily newspaper. It's been a kind of long time thing in that sense. My first editor at Knopf, Andrew Miller, had the idea for this book, really. And again, it was around 2000 and the all the excitement over the Mets and the Yankees at that time. And it ended up being delayed a lot by existing book contracts, other ways I had to make a living. But finally just went into it. But yeah, I think there is I write a lot of historical fiction. And, I find you generally, you can't make this stuff up. You can't really outdo reality. What I try to do in fiction is really kind of hone it and center it and explore it. With nonfiction, it's close to the same thing. The hard part with this, since it's a history of the game and the city for about 150 years, was compressing this to something. And it took me quite a while. My editors were very patient, Andrew Miller and John Freeman at Canop. They, they finally said, I passed in this gigantic manuscript. I refused to tell anyone how long it was.
Really? I was
And they,
just going
and
to
they,
ask how many
oh,
pages.
I want, and they looked at this and they said, like, for a couple of years, and finally they said, all right, we'll cut it in half. So the second
Wow.
half, this book goes through 1945. The second half will be out in the spring of
Oh, you have another
2026.
another
So that's,
volume.
yeah, volume two, going from 45 to the present, will be spring of
Wow.
2026. So
That is awesome. Oh,
yeah, we
will you
have.
come back? I hope you'll come back.
Oh yeah, yeah, and we have, Babe Ruth is on the cover of this one. We have for the second one, Jackie Robinson will be on
Cool.
the cover, and that's one of the reasons we decided to split it at 45 because that's the end of the year. That's when he's signed by the Dodgers, and everything changes, and the sport is finally integrated.
Just a quick story. This is another New York writer, but
Yeah,
Robert
sure.
Caro, when he brought his first
Oh,
copy of the
amazing
Power,
writer.
he brought his first copy of the Power Broker into the offices at I guess the same publisher at Knopf,
Mhm.
and they said, "Great, how many copies is this?" And he said, "One."
I know I'm fortunate enough to know him. We kind of bonded over a Brooklyn congressman named Emmanuel Seller, who was a congressman for 50 years. and has a big role in the second book because he kind of exposed how much money the Dodgers and Giants were making, and despite their poor mouthing, and they then went out to the coast, but he was a terrific congressman. Yeah, Caro is an incredible writer, and
The great,
it's
yeah.
50th anniversary now of the
I
Power
know,
Broker.
I know. I just saw they have an exhibit at the New York Historical Society. I've got to get there. Um, and of course, we're all waiting eagerly for his fifth volume of his Lyndon Johnson series that we're just praying he's able to finish.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
when it comes to you brought up the name of Jackie Robinson, so we've got to discuss it. Segregation.
yeah. Yes.
Cap Anson is somehow
Oh,
still in the Hall of Fame. And
right,
I
right.
believe that he should either be removed from the Hall of Fame or there should be a major appendix or some kind of addition amendment put onto his plaque because what he did was inexcusable
Yeah.
and explained New York's role in the rise of segregation in baseball, an unavoidable and unpleasant aspect of this, but we've got to talk about it.
Yeah, I agree. That's an interesting thought. My worry about if you start setting up a kind of morals clause for the Hall of Fame is you're going to push out a lot of people, and horribly, a lot of people were collusive in that sort of racism. Cap Anson was certainly one of the leaders of it, and his name should rot in history.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, early on, I mean, this was a sport that everybody played, everybody of every class, very democratizing, except for very early on in baseball, even on the amateur level, people of color were excluded from it. It was the very first league, the National Association, these leading black scholars who also ran a team in Philadelphia went to the National Association meeting in New York and said, "Hey, can we join?" And they were told, no, go form your own league. Nonetheless, there were at least 55 known people of color in the majors and minors until 1898, when the color line was, completely enforced. Um, the Walker brothers were the last ones in the majors in 1884. And this is a horrible story of segregation, just as segregation and racism is such the horrible part of America. And I hope I tell that story well enough because it is an awful one. And really everybody, as I said, everybody was collusive in this. John Montgomery Ward, who is a fascinating character who starts the Players League, leads the players out to form their own league in 1890. He wanted to integrate that league, but the players, labor radicals though they were, said no. So this was a lot of people, but it's also, I hope, an inspiring story in that it's all these amazing black athletes and owners and general managers finding a way where there was no way, starting their own leagues despite having very little capital behind them, starting their own leagues and eventually fighting their way into the major league. So there's that uplifting aspect of it too.
When it comes to the way all of this is building New York, not, I think we've described here pretty
Yeah,
well how New York built baseball, but
yeah.
how do all these social and um, financial and these other factors, the way the stadiums are built, and transportation, how does the game itself start to build and change the city itself?
Yeah, very good question. It was really very closely tied to the power structure in the city. And pretty much all the early teams had a political machine connection, kind of a Tammany connection. The Giants in particular were the Tammany team, and that eventually they really suffered from it because, like Tammany, they just kind of took all the money out of it they could. But even Jacob Rupert had been a Tammany congressman for 4 terms, helping to bring in the German vote, and he takes over the Yankees. You really had to have a connection like that. Otherwise, to get rid of you, Tammany might do something like run a street through your stadium, which is what happened to the Yankees Park up in Washington Heights, which is what happened to the original Polo Grounds down near Central Park. So You had to have this tie-in, and it's amazing how sort of innately corrupt it is. For instance, John McGraw in the off season ran a pool hall around Herald Square. One of his partners in that was Arnold Rothstein, the notorious gambler
Mhm.
who would
We just did
eventually
an
fix
episode
the
on
World
him,
Series.
actually. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
fascinating character. Yeah, great David P.S. Trucca book about him, and fascinating character. And but he was a partner with McGraw, and of course, like all pool halls in the city, and like most entertainments, period, they paid off to the cops. And this was how, the police department was run on this kind of paying basis. You only got in if you had sort of a Tammany rabbi, as they called it, a Tammany guy who could help you get in, and you had to pay to get in. And of course, that meant you had to take bribes if you were to make this worthwhile for yourself. Uh, and these sort of corrupting systems went on and on. The one thing to be said for it in terms of baseball was that it was better to have the people's representatives in charge than to have the teams calling the shots. And I think that's sort of the corruption of our time. All these amazing how many New York teams have gotten huge uh, public subsidies for their parks, the baseball stadiums, also Madison Square Garden, all these places. Uh, and in return, they give the public nothing. The Yankees and Mets have actually eliminated huge numbers of seats open to the general public because they'd rather have luxury suites. This to me is this to me is obscene, and it's amazing that none of our representatives seem to have even demanded anything better.
I was going to ask this later in the episode, but I may as well just ask it
Sure,
now.
sure.
How important is the cost of going to a game, and how did
Oh,
the ability to attend a game impact how popular the game got? Just as an example, I was talking to a friend, and he said it was $40 to park his car at Citi Field
yeah.
this weekend, and that's not even the price of getting into a game and buying a pennant and
Oh,
buying a foam finger. How important was the access of the game in a time where you couldn't listen even yet, I think probably even on the radio, and you couldn't certainly watch it on TV.
oh yeah, the game used to be very accessible. Even then, the owners were stupid about not doing things like eventually they started to give benefits to let kids in. You had the Dodgers, I think, had the what was it, the something hole, the peephole gang or something in the 30s where they let kids in for cheaper into the bleachers. But yeah, baseball has always sort of been terrible, but it was very accessible and you could get in. And again, it was sort of this democratizing thing because you sat, unless you were sitting right behind the dugout, even that wasn't that expensive. You sat with everyone else. I mean, I remember my father getting tickets for us to go to a game in Fenway Park in the 70s, like two rows behind the dugout. It was like $5 a piece. You know, this was much more what it was like. Now it's kind of obscene. I've been to the Legend Suite seats, thanks to friends who know bankers,
Yeah,
essentially in New
right,
York.
right.
It's crazy. In the you have access to this kind of private dining room where all the food, including the lobster tails, are free. They only charge you for alcohol. Uh, and you go and sit there, and they can't sell these seats. It'll be the only part of the Yankee Stadium empty. So it's ridiculous. At its peak for capacity in the late 20s and 30s, Yankee Stadium could hold 82,000 people, including standing room. Today, it's something like
For it,
46,000
yeah.
in its third incarnation. And that's essentially they've eliminated an entire Fenway Park worth of seats and gotten enormous subsidies. The other day, Hal Steinbrenner earlier this year was talking about how he was warning us that the Yankees payroll was unsustainable. And I was thinking, like, how many free stadiums does your family want? We were up to two, essentially. You know.
When I was a kid, the price that I remember for the upper deck at Shea was 650. So
Yeah.
we're talking in the I probably it's I'm probably it's probably less in the late 80s, but I'm probably thinking of more of the mid 90s when I was, 10, 12, 13. And I also remember that Shea Stadium had one bar, and my dad, I mean, of course they came around with the beer, but my
Mhm.
dad would stop in the Loge on our way up to our seats in the green, and it was the only place in the stadium to get a Beck's. So we would stop in this dank, disgusting bar with the film of beer on the ground, and you couldn't even
Yeah.
see in there. I mean, I was a little kid. I couldn't even see over all the people. It was really just a gross, harrowing kind of disgusting bar. And now these stadiums have like bars everywhere and there's clubs everywhere and they take up a
Yeah.
huge amount of space in the stadium for these places that only select people can get in.
Oh, it's all upscale. You're not even, I don't even understand how this is legal, but I believe in no park, no arena in New York. And again, it's all everybody's involved with this nonsense. The Devils, the Nets, all these teams which have failed for years and been rewarded with our tax money. But uh, I don't think you're allowed to buy anything with cash anymore.
Yeah, I
I
mean,
don't understand. I mean, isn't it legal tender anymore? Apparently not in a ballpark, a publicly subsidized ballpark. Yeah, same thing. I used to go watch the Yankees in the late 70s. 250, you could buy a ticket for most games, day of the game. You went and
went
you sat
right
up
in. Yeah.
high, but you move over behind home plate, great seat. This was how it used to be. And it's ridiculous that it's not that way anymore. And we the people have got to tell our representatives to make these, because these teams aren't going anywhere, despite
Right.
the threats, despite they're not moving out of the New York area. It's the biggest market in the country. It's the richest city in the world again, and we gotta make them treat the fans right.
As we wrap things up here, I want to ask, I think you're right that there's a major dividing line with the rise
Mm,
of Jackie Robinson. That clearly changes the
mm,
game in New York
yeah. Mm,
significantly. I guess in my head, until this moment, I thought of the dividing line as being when the Giants and Dodgers leave, and then a few years later you get the Mets.
mm,
But you say there's a
mm,
remarkable period of stability from those early 1900s when the game has established its rules until the middle of the 20th century, until the
oh yeah.
1940s and 50s. Explain how that stability kind of rose and took hold. And it feels very much like it is now, where these two teams aren't going anywhere and there's not going to be another team in New York.
Oh
Explain
yeah.
that. Yeah.
Oh yeah. No, you had from 1903 to 1953, you had 50 years. You had um 16 teams in the same 11 cities, three in New York. Um, you could be most of this time was before the rise of electronic media, before radio and TV. So you could really compete almost anywhere. If you were, Branch Rickey proved that in St. Louis. He could build teams that competed with the Yankees, who were in a much bigger market because essentially most of your money came from the gate. And he built competitive teams and they compete. The Yankees were they imitated him actually in building farm systems. There was an exploitive part of this in that, I mean, what is a league but a cartel? But there was an
Yeah, you use
exploitive
that
part of
word in the
this.
book. I'm like,
Yeah.
wow, it's a cartel. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it means like you exclude people, and horribly in this case, black players. You exclude other teams from other cities as well as bringing teams in. But on the other hand, before jet travel, basically going from the East Coast to St. Louis was a long trip. Uh, so you were regionally limited anyway, but you had this you built these minor league systems. You made these kind of all these smaller cities your thralls and brought guys up through there, and you controlled the players with the reserve clause, which is absolutely unconstitutional. Amazing how it survived so many years. The idea that once your contract with an employer has ended, they can still retain your services, whether or not you like it. It was an amazing corruption of everything we hold dear in America. But so there were some awful things that supported this. But that led to this. It was this huge stability. The teams wore basically the same uniforms. You didn't have this City Connect nonsense. There wasn't a different gear connect sale every
Right,
two
right.
minutes. These were teams that, and they built this sort of loyalty to them over many a year.
What do you imagine going to a game in one of the stadiums, I guess we're sort of familiar with, Yankee Stadium? I mean, it was
Mhm.
redone, but
Yeah,
you and I have certainly been there. I was never at Ebbets Field, of course, never at the
yeah,
Polo Grounds.
me neither.
My dad was there at the Polo Grounds, not Ebbets Field. What do you imagine it was like, just from all the reading you've done and all the research you've done about walking into that stadium and seeing the beautiful green field?
Oh, it was amazing. And I was fortunate enough to be old enough to have experienced a little of that. Didn't get to the Polo Grounds or Ebbets Field either, but I went to the first Yankee Stadium. And really, after it was kind of gutted, that was a whole different park. But I got to the first Yankee Stadium in 1967, and I got to Fenway Park in the late 60s and 70s. And that was amazing. It was just awesome just walking up the runway and seeing that. It's one of those boyhood memories you never forget.
I can still feel walking. I used to like to walk out at Shea Stadium, and my dad's seats were in the green, and
Yeah.
we would walk out in the way down the third base side and left field and walk all the way around because now you can't walk around the stadiums anymore. It's all blocked
Yeah.
off. But we'd walk all the way around and see the whole field as we got to our seats. And the smell and the vendors. I mean, what a
Yeah.
lost
Yeah.
art those vendors are that don't walk around anymore the way they used to.
Yeah, they don't really. It's weird now, but
It's
yeah, they used to be
terrible.
able to do that. And in the old days, even you could exit across the field, which was, I think, a big draw to a lot of people.
Yeah, it would
And
have
you
been
see
for
them,
me.
yeah, and you
Um,
realize like what's kind of gone wrong with us that we can't be trusted to do that anymore. But I guess we can't.
all
So,
right. I was wrestling with this with my dad a little bit. What is the all New York team? Is it possible
oh
to
gosh,
go around
yeah.
and find nine guys who represent not just great baseball, but New York baseball?
Yeah, hard to say. Well, let's see. Yogi Berra, I rely a lot on people like Bill James and other great statisticians for this. But Yogi Berra, who James ranks as, one or two with Johnny Bench, is the greatest catcher. And he did play an amazing number of games every year. Lou Gehrig at first base. Um, One of the generally considered the greatest first baseman ever. Second base, maybe Jackie Robinson,
Hard to
who
not say that,
who
right?
didn't and who didn't break into the majors till he was 28.
Right.
Probably didn't have his who knows how amazing his stats would have been. Transformative athlete. Shortstop. I guess you have to put Derek Jeter there. Um, just in that he's, I think, sixth all time in hits.
Yeah, it's hard
I
to not
mean,
say.
one of the
Much to my
amazing.
chagrin, it's hard to not
Yeah,
say.
not
Who's
not
the
the
quin
not the
who's
best glove ever, but amazing. Yeah.
who's the quintessential New York third baseman?
I don't, it's like I can't put Alex Rodriguez there, great as he was for the
Yeah.
juicing. It would just be wrong. I'm not sure that leaves the likes of well, possibly it might be a place to put a Met with David Wright.
Oh, okay.
Possibly it's
I'll take that.
yeah,
I'll take that.
there was some Freddie Lindstrom on the old Giants. Red Rolf was a great there. Craig Nettles, but maybe David
All
Wright
right,
he
I'm
should
with you
fit
there.
there.
Now in terms of the outfield, clearly
Mhm.
there are a number of applicants for center field, so you may as
Yeah,
well just
yeah.
say the four or five of them,
Well,
right?
that's center field is like it's amazing. And incredible in the 50s that you had those three great athletes there with Duke Snyder, Mickey Mantle, and Willie Mays. I think you got to put Mays, rest in peace, in center
Yeah,
field. He's just such a phenomenal athlete, such an amazing player, and for so long.
yeah,
Bill James says that Mantle was better at his peak, and I don't doubt him, but Mays was so great for so long. I put him in center field. Unfortunately, we lost many of his best years, but
yeah.
I'd rank the Mays, Mantle, DiMaggio, and Snyder. Um,
Maybe
uh,
Darryl Strawberry is like a fourth outfielder, although it's such
if,
the air is so thin, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
but you got to put Ruth
Yeah,
in
right. I forgot about
left or
him, right.
right. You got to put
Yeah.
Babe Ruth in left or right.
Right.
Um, for another outfielder, yeah. I mean, and the thing is too, these guys
Reggie, I
could
don't
have
know, I
all
guess.
played other positions.
Yeah.
Reggie is a big candidate, although he was only there for five. Somebody who maybe should be in a corner outfield slot was my father's favorite athlete when he was a kid, Mel Ott, who
Uh,
was a great hitter. Um, he was something like third in home runs until like the 60s, late 60s, all time. So maybe Master Melvin should be the other guy there. So many great ones. Strawberry, Carl Furillo, guys like
yeah.
Bernie Williams. Bernie Williams had a point where he said, like, hey, I've played my whole career against juicers and didn't juice. Shouldn't I be in the hall?
It's
Maybe.
not a bad argument.
But yeah,
Um,
and on the mound, well,
oh my goodness, how do we even start, right?
Christy Mathewson, I guess, Whitey Ford, who holds the all-time lowest lifetime ERA for any post 1920 starter in the lively ball. Clay Kershaw may break that,
Hmm.
but it's
Seaver,
the Whitey
Seaver would
Ford.
be
Tom
one.
Tom Seaver is another one.
Gooden,
Yeah, not around quite long enough,
yeah.
but
Andy Pettit, yeah.
yeah, Carl Hubble, King Carl
Uh,
Hubble in the 30s, great Giants pitcher. Guys like Dazzy Vance on the Dodgers who are pretty much forgotten. Um, but yeah, they and of course Mariano Rivera for the
oh yeah, I
closer,
forgot about him
like
too.
the greatest.
All right, my last question is, will you come back to discuss the second half of this
Lo-
book one day?
love to
All
do
right.
so.
Would be great. Kevin Baker, the author of The New York Game, Baseball and the Rise of a New City. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Check
Great
out the
to see
book.
you.
Yeah, it was awesome. Check out the book and his website, which is kevinbaker.info. He's on the website formerly known as Twitter at Baker Author. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.